For well over 175 years, the Communist Manifesto has been one of the most influential and, let's be honest, controversial political documents ever written. It's a name we all know, but how many of us have actually read it? So what does it actually say? In this explainer, we're going to try to set aside all the modern baggage and go straight to the source, to understand its core arguments in the world that it came from. Right from the jump, it opens with one of the most famous lines in political history. This tells you right away, this isn't some dry academic textbook. It's a piece of political theater, written with a real sense of fire and urgency. It immediately frames communism not as some fringe idea, but as a major force that the old powers of Europe were already deeply afraid of. All right, so here's our roadmap. We'll start by setting the scene in 1848. Then we'll dive into the manifesto's big theory of history. After that, we'll look at its diagnosis of capitalism, get clear on what it claims communists actually want, and then wrap it all up with its famous call to action. To really get the manifesto, you have to get the moment it was written in. I mean, this thing wasn't written in a quiet library somewhere. It was written on the absolute brink of revolution. This timeline really shows you just how chaotic this period was. The Industrial Revolution had just completely turned society on its head. You had people pouring in from the countryside into these brand new, crowded, often miserable cities. By the 1830s and 40s, these huge factors were creating incredible wealth, but they were also creating new kinds of poverty and social unrest. It's right in the middle of all this that a workers' group called the Communist League asks two young thinkers, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, to write up a platform for them. And get this, the ink was barely dry on the manifesto when, in February 1848, revolutions just exploded all across the continent. Talk about timing. So let's get into the central idea, the engine that really drives the entire argument of the manifesto. How did Marx and Engels look at the huge sweep of human history? Okay, so this is the crucial point. For them, history isn't really about great kings or big ideas or nations. It's driven by economics, more specifically, the conflict between different economic classes. This idea is called historical materialism. Basically, it's the theory that the material conditions of a society, who owns the stuff and who has to work for the owners, that's the foundation that everything else, like politics, laws, and even culture, gets built on top of. And they really stressed that this was nothing new. They saw this exact same dynamic playing out all through history. You had freeman and slave in the ancient world, lord and serf in the Middle Ages. In every era, you have this fundamental conflict between an oppressor class and an oppressed class. And it's that constant struggle, they argued, that pushes history forward and eventually leads to a complete revolutionary reset of society. All right, so now we get to their analysis of their own time, what they called the epoch of the bourgeoisie. They argued that this old, complicated pattern of class struggle had been boiled down to one final showdown between two huge new classes. So first up, you have the bourgeoisie. As you can see, these are the modern capitalists, the factory owners, the bankers, the people who owned huge tracts of land. They own what the manifesto calls the means of social production. That's a really key term. Back then, it meant the brand new steam-powered factories, the railroads, and all the money, the capital you needed to build them. And facing them, you've got the proletariat. This is the modern industrial working class. They don't own the factories, they don't own any land. According to the manifesto, the only thing they really possess is their ability to work, their time, their energy, their skill. The text calls this their labor power, and they have to sell it to the bourgeoisie for a wage, just to survive. And this slide just lays out the core conflict perfectly. The two classes have interests that are fundamentally at odds. The goal of the bourgeoisie is to grow their capital, which means getting the most work for the lowest possible wage. And the goal of the proletariat? Well, it's to get the highest possible wage for their work. The manifesto argues this isn't some simple misunderstanding that can be worked out. It's a structural conflict that's baked right into the system itself. Now, here's a part of the manifesto that might actually surprise a lot of people. It doesn't just trash the bourgeoisie. In a weird way, it almost expresses a kind of admiration for what they managed to pull off. The text argues that the bourgeoisie and the capitalist system they built was the most dynamic, most revolutionary force human history had ever seen. Period. The text just lists all these incredible things they did. They completely shattered the old feudal world of kings and aristocrats. They created a global market. They unleashed technologies that made the pyramids look like child's play. They basically tore up the old world and remade the entire globe in their own image.
They weren't a conservative force at all. They were radical disruptors. This famous line just perfectly captures that feeling of constant, dizzying change. The Manifesto describes this era as one of uninterrupted disturbance, everlasting uncertainty and agitation. All the old traditions, religions, and national borders, they were all just dissolving in the face of the market. But here's the twist. The Manifesto argues that this incredibly powerful system has a fatal flaw. It's so ridiculously productive that it keeps creating these crises of overproduction, basically making too much stuff for the market to actually handle. The text compares it to a sorcerer who summoned up these powerful spirits but can no longer control them. And this leads to the Manifesto's most famous prediction. By creating this huge, concentrated, and poor working class, the proletariat, capitalism has, in the text's own words, created its own gravediggers. The rise of the proletariat isn't some accident. It's the direct and inevitable result of the system itself. Their victory isn't just presented as a goal to hope for, but as a historical certainty. Okay, so that's the diagnosis of the problem. But what about the cure? Now we're going to get into the actual program that the Manifesto lays out. This is the part of the text where they directly respond to the criticisms and fears that people already had about them. This is probably the #1 most famous and most feared idea connected to communism. So, does the Manifesto really call for taking away everybody's personal stuff? The Manifesto is actually very, very specific about this. It draws a really sharp line in the sand. The target isn't all property. It's a very particular kind of property. So here's the difference they lay out. On one hand, you have bourgeois property. This means capital, the factories, the land, the machines that are used to generate profit by hiring other people. They see this as a social power. But on the other hand, they talk about the personal property of, say, a small farmer or a craftsman, the fruit of a man's own labor. And here's the kicker. The Manifesto argues that industrial capitalism is already destroying that kind of small-scale personal property as big companies swallow everything up. So for them, the goal isn't to take a worker's personal savings, but to abolish the system of private ownership of the big stuff, the means of production that they believe exploits that worker. Towards the end of Section 2, the text lays out a 10-point program as a kind of starting place. And it's a fascinating list. You've got ideas that still sound pretty radical to a lot of people today, like getting rid of all rights of inheritance. But then you've got other things like a heavy progressive income tax and free public education for everyone, things that have become totally mainstream policies in many countries. It's important to remember, even Marx and Engels said in later editions that this specific list was a product of its time and would probably look pretty different if they wrote it today. And that brings us to the very end of the document, the part that has echoed down through history as a powerful rallying cry for movements all over the world. And those are the final, thunderous words. They really capture the essence of the whole message that, for the vast majority of people, the system as it is offers them nothing but exploitation, their chains. So a revolution isn't really a risk, it's an opportunity to gain everything, a world to win. And that final call is for international solidarity. The argument is that the struggle of working people is the same everywhere, no matter what country you're in, ending with that famous cry, "Working men of all countries unite." So after all this time, the Manifesto is still a document that forces us to ask some really big questions. You know, its predictions didn't all come true, and its historical legacy is incredibly and often painfully complex, but it does leave us with a final thought. No matter what your politics are, how can its central ideas about class, about power, and about what drives historical change help us make sense of the world we're all living in today?